For today's lesson, I'd like to talk about godly parenting. And I mean by that, God's parenting. Now, I don't know whether we think about it that way, but God actually is our parent. If you take a look at Ephesians chapter 4, in verse 6, Paul writes, "There is one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all." We are, in fact, God's offspring, which makes us his children. We know that because in Genesis chapter 1 it tells us that God is the creator, and he created the heavens, the earth, and everything in them. And that includes us. In Genesis chapter 1 and verse 26 and 27 and 28, it talks about the creation of humankind. And it says there that man was created in the image and likeness of God. Because of that, we know that we have a dual nature. Humankind consists of kind of two aspects or two elements. We have a physical body of flesh and blood, which is appropriate for living in this three-dimensional spatial universe. But we also have within that body a spirit, a spiritual nature, just as God is a spirit. And it's important for us to remember that fact. And since we are the created and God is the creator, he begat us, he brought us into existence, and for that reason we are his offspring and he is our Father. So what about parenting? What do I mean by parenting? Parenting is a process of bringing up and caring for our children. So basically, it involves a process of raising someone from infancy or a state of immaturity to adulthood, to a state of maturity. And that's what parenting is all about. And so just as we as earthly parents do that to our children, God did that to humankind. And if you think about it, he really had to do that because in the beginning, at the time of creation, Adam and Eve were brought into existence. They needed to get to know their father. And their father needed to teach them the things that they needed to know and to bring them along. And God has done this over generations in this transition in the way he has interacted with humankind. And this is the process that I want to refer to as godly parenting. So let's go back and take a look at the way things started. In the beginning, when Adam and Eve were created, they were created in God's image, which means they were holy. They were holy. They were perfect. They were in unison with God, in total fellowship with him. They had no knowledge of good and evil. They were godlike, if you will. But then something happened. Satan, working through the serpent, deceived Eve into doing something she wasn't supposed to do, and that was to partake of the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And when she did that, her eyes were opened, and she had then an awareness of good and evil. And she shared this fruit with Adam, and he foolishly partook as well. And so he too became to have open eyes to see this contrast between good and evil. And that was a game changer, because having free will, they now had choices to make in their life as to what path they were going to take. God instructed them further in this regard, and we see his instruction as a caring father for his offspring. We see it in the interactions he had with Cain and Abel. You recall Cain and Abel offered worship to God. Abel's worship was accepted, but Cain's was not. And because of that, in Genesis chapter 4 and verse 5, the text says that Cain became very angry and his countenance fell, right? His facial expression changed. It became one of frustration, a grimace, carrying of anger, a feeling of anger. And so the Lord came to Cain as a father would, saying, "Why are you angry and why is your countenance falling?" So the father called for his child to have a little period of self-examination. What's going on? Think about this. And then he continued by saying, if you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you. So our father there was saying to Cain, look, if you do well, everything will be okay, and you'll feel good about it. But if you don't, there is a danger. Sin is crouching by to take you like a roaring lion, and its desire is for you to sin. And following that, God gave his expectation. And here it is in verse 7. 4 words, but you must master it. So there was the expectation that God placed forth for his children, that we were to master sin, that we were to target holiness, to be holy as God is holy, and to avoid missing that mark. So we then find that God took us into and dealt with us in what I like to think of as a period of infancy. And in this period, God placed a great emphasis on physical behavior. And by that I mean teaching us the do's and the don'ts regarding our behavior. And we find this in the teachings of the prophets, and we find it most notably in the work and the giving of the law to the nation of Israel. Moses presented to the people of Israel the 10 commandments that God had given him. And I want to look at those commandments for just a moment. In those 10 commandments, we find, interestingly enough, that the first 3 commands that God gave the nation of Israel involved how to treat your father, how to interact with him, right? The first one, I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods before me. I am your father, is what he was saying, and there's none other. In verse 4, you shall not make for yourself an idol or any likeness of what is in heaven above or earth beneath or water under the earth. You won't worship them, you shall not serve them. There is no substitute for the father, all right? The authority over the child, the leadership, the mentoring, the teaching comes from the father and none other, and that's what he was basically saying. We move on now. Verse 7, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. So there God was saying, you will honor me. You will treat me with high regard and with respect as your father. Okay? Then it goes off and starts talking about specific behaviors in the conduct of their life. Okay? You shall remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. You're going to keep a day of rest. A day when you think about me and the things I have done for you, and you take a break from the travails of the world. It goes on and it says, the next one, honor your father and your mother, your earthly father and your mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house or anything therein. All right? These were all specific behaviors, if you will. So what we find happening here in this period that I called the infancy, we see in this infancy God focusing on behaviors and in order to control behavior and to teach the do's and don'ts, he gave them the law, the old covenant, if you will. And that consisted of the law and commands. This is what I call the do's and the don'ts, if you will. Okay. So, what happened? What happened was people became aware of sin through commands and through the law. It defined for them what sin was. But they failed. They failed in keeping the laws. They were drawn away and enticed by the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, things that brought about sin, just as we are today, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Romans 3:23. So there was a pattern that then emerged. The people would misbehave, and then when they misbehaved, there was discipline applied. And there was discipline specified within the law itself that was executed individually against people who broke the law. But there was also discipline that God invoked and put upon the people when the people by and large sinned, right? When they turned away from their Father to others, He brought up other nations against them, if you will, as discipline or as punishment for that. And one might even say God could do this in many ways. We read in the text where He did it through other nations. I would add to this just a comment I will make, a side comment. God could also do it through something as simple as a virus to get people's attention and to bring people to repentance. So with this pattern of misbehaving and then discipline, we see people basically striving to keep the commands, but failing. So what happened next? How did God deal with this? We see then a transition to this period of what I call adulthood, to look in terms of what He wants from adult behavior. And in that we see a transition to the spiritual nature, to focus on the heart and on the attitudes. And you see this in what Jesus offered in the Sermon on the Mount as He began His teaching. Notice in Matthew chapter 5, verse 21, He said, "You have heard the ancients were told, 'You shall not commit murder.' But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court." So the command was, don't murder. But Jesus focused on the spiritual nature, on the heart behind that, and said, don't get angry, because it's the anger that builds up within you that leads you to a bad behavior, in this case, murder. He said many other things here too. He said, you've heard that it said, you shall not commit adultery. You shall not cheat on your wife. But I say to you that everyone who looks on a woman to lust for her has committed adultery already in his heart. Again, Jesus focusing on the spiritual nature, the intent, the attitude, the heart itself. He said further in verse 33, you have heard that it's been told, you shall not make false vows. You shall fulfill your vows. But I say to you, take no oath at all. Let your statement be yes, yes, or no, no. So don't swear. Don't take an oath. Stand for something. Be a person of integrity, right? Be who you are, and let that always be the nature that you have, one of truth and honesty. You've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Somebody does something bad to you, you return the favor. You give them it back. But what did Jesus say? But I say to you, do not resist him who is evil. But whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you, take your shirt, let him have your coat also. So Jesus was not about revenge, payback. No, he was about returning good for evil, having a heart that was tolerant, okay, that was kind towards that person. So what we see then here is that in going to this pattern from infancy to adulthood, God was trying to instruct us on a spiritual nature, and in that sense to focus on the heart. And so as part of the new covenant, we see Jesus talking about heart and about attitude. about an attitude that can be there. So what was the message that God was trying to convey through Jesus? Think about this. The message that God was trying to convey is the following. If you want to control behavior, you do so by having the right heart and the right spirit. Our heart, the attitudes that we have, are the things that control our physical behavior. And so what Jesus was trying to do was to get us to change our heart and let that change the behavior so that we could keep the commands and be holy before God and live a holy life. Now the question that we always struggle with is, okay, how do we do it? How do I control my attitude? How do I develop the right attitudes? How do we do that? Actually, a lawyer stumbled upon that, not intentionally. He was trying to test the Lord, but he brought it out in Matthew chapter 22 when he came to the Lord and said, "Teacher, which is the great commandment of the law?" And Jesus answered him and said, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend the whole law and the prophets." So what was the answer to this? How do you control the attitude? How do you develop this right spiritual nature? You do it by having a heart of love. John the Apostle is known as the Apostle of Love. And what he wrote about in 1 John chapter 4 is just filled with love and the importance of love. In chapter 4, verse 7, "Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God, and everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. The one who does not love does not know God, for God is love." Verse 19, "We love because He first loved us. If someone says, 'I love God,' and hates his brother, he's a liar. For the one who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. And this commandment we have from Him, that one who loves God should love his brother also." God is love. He is our Father. He wants us to be like Him. That means that we need to be all about love. So what is love, and how does love affect attitudes? Well, we think of love as a feeling of deep emotion. More specifically, it is an unselfish concern for the good of another. An unselfish concern for the good of another. So how does that shape attitude? Paul talks about that in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 when he talks about what love accomplishes. And listen to this list. Love is patient. All right? Love is kind and is not jealous. It's not envious. Love does not brag and is not arrogant. Love does not act unbecomingly. It does not seek its own. It is not provoked. It does not take into account the wrong suffered. Okay? It's not keeping a tally sheet of things you've done bad to me that I need to make up for and return the favor. No. Love does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices in the truth. It's not about deception. It's not about lying. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. It takes it for the good of others. Love never fails. Okay? Jesus said, "If you love me, you will keep my commandments." We're told to love our neighbor as ourselves. It's interesting, the passage in Ephesians chapter 4 that talks about marriage, talks about the importance of husbands loving their wives. And it says the two become one flesh when they're married. So we love our wives, we're loving ourselves. And if we want what's best for ourselves, that means your wife is part of you. We want what's best for her too. Love drives everything. So now let's pause and go back. That's godly parenting. How does this apply to us, and what do we take from this? Well, here's the lesson that I take from this. We have a dual nature. We have a physical body of flesh and blood, but we have a spirit inside that body. And as earthly parents, I need to nurture, I need to be parenting on both of those natures among my children. So I want to teach them by commands to control behavior. I want them to understand what good and bad behavior is. And that's done by commanding them. Do this, don't do this. Okay? And when they fail in that regard, there needs to be discipline. Discipline so they understand this is important. Okay? There's a reason for doing this. Now, as they grow older, however, I need to instill within them something that will allow them to carry forth this behavior into adulthood. Okay? And not just be some kind of a chain they wear around their neck as children because mom and dad put it there. No, I want to instill within them a sense of values and purpose and understanding that there's a reason why these are the right and wrong things to do. And that comes from teaching the Word of God. So the second aspect of this is to be nurturing their spiritual nature. And that's how we ultimately control their behavior when they become adults. We do so by teaching and instill within them and developing within them the right attitude, an attitude that changes the heart based upon love. So, as parents, as earthly parents, we have a very important job to do. And we have a limited time to do it. But the lesson is there. We must always be focusing not just on the physical nature and physical behavior, but upon the spiritual nature and the spirit that lies within that. So let's all give that serious consideration and think about what it really means to be a godly parent.